Hello! It's time for even more fun properties. Luckily, the first three are review, and then most of the other ones are just fancy names for things that you already know, and we're just going to use our brains to figure them out. So if you remember on the video from yesterday, we used RST123. So this foldable just goes over those again. So remember, R stood for reflexive, and it meant when one thing is equal to itself. So for instance, 3 equals 3, or xy is equal to xy. Anything like that, it's the same thing is equal to itself, which actually, believe it or not, comes in handy. The next flap talks about the symmetric property, which is when I'm talking about two things. So the symmetric property lets you switch the order. So if A equals B, then B equals A. So for example, you might have that if AB is congruent to CD, we can just flip the order and make it CD is congruent to AB. The symmetric property just means that it's the same either way. So RST. T has to do with three things. So if you have A equals B and B equals C, then that means that A is equal to C. So for instance, if A equals 3 and B equals 3, then that means A equals, well, that's a horrible way. A equals B. Since they were both equal to the same thing, you can use the transitive property to say that they're equal to each other, which will be super helpful when we do things with angles. So you might have something, if you want another example, you might have angle 1 is equal to angle 2, angle 2 is equal to angle 3. So I'm going to put that with the dot, dot, dot. Then that means angle 1 is equal to angle 3. And when we start proving stuff next week, that is very, very handy. Okie doke. So the next ones are all really algebraic reasonings, and you've been solving a lot of equations so far in class. All this is doing is we're going to work on just adding a justification for why we can do all the different things that we've done. And don't worry, I'm not going to make you do this like on everything. This is just kind of our baby steps getting into proof, showing it with something we already know. So we're going to start all of these with if A equals B. That's what I'm starting with. Then the addition property, what does that sound like I'm going to do? You're going to add. So on the left side, I'm going to add C. On the right side, I'm going to add C. And that is where that is. If you want to write on that flap and highlight or anything, you can. So the addition property of equality just means I can add the same thing to both sides. So something you're used to seeing is this equation in the example. If 9x minus 8 equals 19, the addition property says that I can add 8 on both sides and therefore conclude that then 9x equals 27. And that's all we're doing right now. We're not going all the way finally to the answer. We're just showing that one property, which is I can add stuff to both sides. Well, if I can add stuff to both sides, wouldn't it be great if I could subtract something from both sides? And that's where I have the minus C, the minus C. So in my example that I made up, if 3x plus 13 equals 20, the subtraction property means that I can subtract the same thing on both sides. And when I do that, the left side is left with 3x. The 13 minus 13 reduces to 0, and 20 minus 13 is 7. Once again, right now we're not focusing on solving all the way, we're just using single properties. Next we have the multiplication property. So what do you think we're going to do? We're going to multiply by the same number or expression on both sides, in this case c. So in my handy dandy example, if x over 2 equals 3, then I can multiply both sides by 2 using the multiplication property. And I get that x equals 3 times 2 is 6. So that one's nice and did get solved for us. Division property, you're going to divide by the same thing on both sides. So if 8x equals 32, then we can divide by 8 on both sides. And that gives x equals 4. The substitution property looks like a lot of words, but it just means if I start with two things that are equal, then I can replace those things in any situation. So for instance, if 3x plus y equals 10 and y equals 2, I can go back and wherever that y is in the equation, I can replace it with 2. Which in Algebra 1 you probably did a whole bunch of solving with that. So this equation could transform to 3x plus 2 equals 10 using the substitution property, which once again will be a very handy property. And the last one is the distributive property, which is just talking about what? Distributing, which remember just means when you have stuff outside the parentheses and you multiply it or distribute it to each term, in case you have forgotten, although we have mentioned it in class. So if 3 parentheses y minus 2 equals 12, then we can distribute and make that 3y, 3 times negative 2 is negative 6, and then bring down your equals 12. And that's as far as we're going. Once again, we're just learning the very basic steps, single steps, and how we can support them. We aren't focusing right there on actually solving it all the way out. That's it. Make sure to turn this into Google Classroom.